Good evening, everyone. Good to see you. Welcome for tonight, our final session of Torah Bound, this six-part series as we've been exploring the themes of Pirkei Avot, themes rooted in our communal obligation, our relationship to one another, and how we live in the world with an eye towards creating for ourselves BJ's community covenant. And I know you've been hearing all about that the last few weeks. We've been looking at the themes of communal obligation, how we show up in community, what our shared values are, how we honor the Torah of our community, what the Torah of our community is. Last week, how we hold sacred disagreement, and tonight, a real question of how we get there. What are the spiritual qualities and practices that can help us to live out that vision? And it is such a privilege to welcome, to lead us in that learning tonight, Dena Weiss. Dena is the Rosh Beit Midrash and senior faculty at Hadar. She is Rosh Beit Midrash and senior faculty at Hadar, where she teaches Talmud and Midrash and Hasidut. She earned a BA in religious studies from NYU and an MA in theology from Harvard Divinity School. She's studied and taught in a variety of Jewish educational settings, including Drisha, Midreshet Lindenbaum, and Pardes. And she currently serves as the editor-in-chief of the Mima'amakim Journal of Jewish Religious Art. Dena Weiss, it is such a privilege to welcome you this evening.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I wanted to just give you one note before we get started, since as Rabbi Mintz mentioned, we're really in a conversation about communal norms. So the communal norm that I have established for my classes whenever I teach on Zoom is, and Marissa and Nancy can testify to this, that I do not allow the chat. The chat is my #1 enemy. I think it is the enemy of civility. So if you have something that's really pressing that you want to share with me that you weren't able to get across during the class, I will send you my email address. You are more than welcome to reach out to me. But we're going to try to keep the conversation actually between us and not in the chat. Okay. I know that for some of you that's going to be an adjustment, but I have a lot of faith in this group, and I'm sure that you will survive. Okay. So Rabbi Mintz asked me to teach about this Mishnah in Avot, and you will see that it is an extremely long Mishnah. We're not actually going to be able to go through and talk about all of the components of the Mishnah on its own. We're actually going to let it wash over us, and then we're going to kind of pick out some gems. We're going to pan for gold from the Mishnah itself. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and I think Rabbi Mintz will send you the link if you want to follow on your own. Okay. So the Mishnah that I've been invited to talk about with you is the 6th Mishnah in Mishnah Avot, and it talks about how great Torah learning is. And you'll see that it's going to compare Torah learning to these other different statuses, right, that are actually very rarefied. The priesthood and royalty, right, and being a king. So certainly not everybody gets to be a priest, but certainly not everybody gets to be a king. Okay, and so there's this sense of, at least when the Mishnah starts out, of exclusivity, right? That there's something about the Torah that is like the priesthood and like royalty, in that not everybody gets to be great in Torah learning. Okay, that is, I think, the assumption of at least the opening of this Mishnah. We're going to complicate that through our learning. But I think it's important to know that is the point of departure for the Mishnah. So it's going to start and say, Gedola Torah Yoter min Akuna u'min Hamachut. Torah learning is greater than the priesthood and greater than royalty. And what makes it so great? Doesn't seem to be any inherent quality, okay? It is royalty is acquired by 30 stages or maybe levels. And the priesthood is acquired through 24, but the Torah is by 48 things. Okay, so I really, I want to be transparent about this, that I think that what the Mishnah is trying to say, even though this is not where we are going to end up, but I think what the Mishnah is trying to say is, you know, it's actually easier in some ways to become a priest and easier in some ways to become a king, because you only need to have 24 or 30 amazing qualities in order to be a good priest, but you need to have 48, twice as many amazing qualities in order to be, you know, someone who's really great in Torah. And that is impressive, right? The more something costs, the more expensive it is, the more impressive it is. And that is, I think, the attitude of at least this initial framing in the Mishnah, that Torah, part of its value comes from how much is involved in acquiring it. How many amazing special qualities are necessary in order to learn the Torah. Okay. And so what we are going to do first is we're just going to read through these 48 qualities. And as I said before, we're not going to be able to talk about what each of them means individually, although we are going to discuss some of them on their own. But what I want you to do is just kind of sit back and relax and let this list wash over you. Maybe get an impression of the kind of things that are on this list. And maybe even start to try to be a little sensitive to what is surprising, right, that you find in this list. Okay, and these are they. Are you ready? We're gonna have 48 amazing levels that one has to achieve in order to be great in Torah. Here we go. Study, attentive listening, proper speech, understanding heart, intelligent heart, awe, fear, humility, joy, purity, attending to the sages, critical give and take with friends, fine argumentation with disciples, clear thinking, study of scripture, study of Mishnah, minimum of trade, minimum of preoccupation with worldly matters, minimum of pleasure, minimum of sleep. This is my least favorite one. Minimum of chatter, minimum of frivolity. By being long-suffering, generous, having faith in the sages, by acceptance of suffering, and learning of Torah is also acquired by one who recognizes their place, rejoices in their portion, makes offense about their words, who takes no credit for themselves, who is loved, who loves God, who loves their fellow creatures, who loves righteous ways, who loves uprightness, who loves reproof. And I think this means who loves to be given negative feedback, not someone who loves to go around and tell people that they need to improve themselves. Okay, here we go. Someone who distances themselves from honors, someone who does not let their heart become swelled on account of their learning, someone who does not delight in giving legal decisions, right? Because somebody who's a jurist has a lot of power. And what we're looking for is someone who is actually going to be really hesitant, right, about using that power and feel kind of uncomfortable with it. Who shares in the bearing of a burden with his colleague, who judges with the scales weighted favorably, who establishes the law in truth, who establishes the law in peace, who composes themselves at their study, who asks and answers, who listens and adds, who learns in order to teach, who learns in order to practice, who makes their teacher wiser, who is exact in what they learned, and one who says something in the name of the one who said it. Okay, so our final kind of capstone quality is somebody who doesn't take credit for someone else's idea. Okay, when they have something to say and it came from someone else, they're very careful to cite where it came from. Thus, you have learned, everyone who says a thing in the name of the one who says it, brings deliverance into the world. It brings geula. As it says, Vatomer Esther lamelech b'shem Mordechai. Esther told the king in Mordechai's name, right, in the Megillah, the way that kind of the whole story ends up evolving, right, is through Esther giving credit to Mordechai, and then the king himself saying, you know what? I also want to give credit to Mordechai. And there being this kind of chain of people wanting to give credit, right, where credit is due. Okay, now, I am sure that all of you sitting here on this call thought to yourself, well, I know a lot of people who have all of these 48 qualities, including me. That was a joke, right? This is a very large and very, very daunting list. And when I first approached this Mishnah, I just thought to myself, you know, what am I going to do with this, right? How am I going to even pretend that I have 10% of this list and demand from a whole community of people that they need to have 100% of this list in order to get into the realm of being someone who's connected to Torah. There's something about this list that is so beautiful, right? There's so many individual qualities here that if they were just on their own, right, would be sort of lovely maxims to live by, right? Like if you want to be a great person in Torah, be someone who listens to others and as yourself, right? That's very nice. But having that with another 46 qualities, right, it starts to become overwhelming. So what I wanted to do was challenge the notion that in order to be great in Torah, what we want to have is all of these qualities. And instead, I'm going to argue that it's sufficient to really embody one. Okay, it seems like in the Mishnah's framing, what makes the acquisition of Torah so impressive is that it has such a high requirement. We're going to look at some texts that complicate that notion and instead suggest that actually what makes Torah great is that it can be made accessible. Okay, so we're going to look at the Sifrei in Dvarim. It's the second source for those of you who are following along in your own source sheets. And here is a midrash on some of the poetry of Ha'azinu. And Moshe says, Ya'arov kamatar lichi, let my teaching fall like rain. Okay, there's a sort of like beautiful image, right, of just Torah, right, and Moshe's words raining down from the sky. And now we're going to understand what this verse means, and we're going to get from the beginning of the verse, Ya'arov kamatar lichi, let my teaching fall like rain, to the end of the verse, which is 2 lines from the bottom in the bold, Tizal katal imrati, my speaking will drip like dew. Okay, so just again to resituate us, this is a verse from Ha'azinu, sort of the opening of Moshe's poem, where he's trying to get the people to listen to him, and he uses this image of rain and dew to invite the people to listen to him. Okay, and so Chachamim Omrim, the sages say, we're back at the top, Moshe said to Israel, perhaps, maybe you don't know how much distress I suffered for the Torah. Maybe you don't know how hard it was. Maybe you don't know how much effort I expended for it. As it says, right? Moshe was there with God for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, that's not easy. I entered among the angels, and I entered among the seraphs, right? The seraphim, one of whom could burn the entire world with its inhabitants, as it says, seraphim omdim mima'alo, the seraphs stand above God. Okay, so Moshe says, I'm not sure you understand that I'm Moshe. right? That I actually got the Torah through labor, suffering, effort, and being in this really dangerous situation where I'm hanging out with these fiery angels, okay? I have given my breath to it, right? I have given my blood for it in the manner that I learned it with distress. Will you too learn it with distress? Or in the way that you learned it with distress, should you teach it in distress? So essentially Moshe says, listen, learning Torah for me was extremely hard. And now I have to figure out, is that an incidental quality to the Torah? Or is that an essential quality to the Torah, right? Do I want to teach my students in the same way that I learned? Do I want them to be suffering? Do I want them to feel like, it's so hard to learn the Torah? Or, right, do you want to be that person who, when they're teaching their students, try to make it as difficult as possible? So the verse says, Tizal katal imrati. My speaking will drip like dew. Okay, and the language here of tizal, right, we're going to make a little pun here. You should look at it as if it were cheap. Okay, zol. And so essentially what the Sifra is imagining, Moshe is saying, is even though it was really, really hard for me, studying Torah was really, really dangerous and challenging, caused me so much suffering, I'm not going to pass that on. In fact, what I want is for the study of Torah to be easy, right? To be cheap. And I think that this Sifrei is almost, right, the opposite of the framing of the Mishnah that we saw, right? In the Mishnah that we saw, what makes the Torah so great? What makes it great is that it's really hard to get to. You need to go through a million hoops. You need to be perfect in 48 ways. It's really impossible. And therefore it's valuable. And the Sifrei has Moshe say, no, actually, learning Torah should be easy. Learning Torah should be accessible. Yes, sometimes it's really hard. Yes, I had to put myself in a lot of danger, but I'm not going to pass on that difficulty to my students. To them, I want learning Torah to be easy. I want learning Torah to be cheap. Okay. And I think that this mindset is actually in our chapter of Avot, but not in the Mishnah that we're focusing on, in the Mishnah 3 Mishnayot ahead, where it says, one who learns from his fellow, one chapter, one halacha, one verse, one word, one letter, is obligated to treat that person with honor. So we find with King David, we're not going to go into the details of this, but he learned something from his advisor, Achitophel, right? No more than 2 things, but he refers to him in Psalms. So you have to sort of assume that David wrote Psalms, right? And he refers to Achitophel in this verse in Psalms as a man who is my equal, my guide, and my beloved friend. Okay, and so we say, let's figure it out, right? If David, king of Israel, learned from Achitophel just 2 things, but he still has all these amazing things to say about him. He's a master, a guide, a friend. Then in the case of one who learns from his fellow, 1 chapter, 1 halacha, 1 verse, 1 word, even 1 letter, all the more so he is under obligation to treat him with honor, right? So we have this model of David who didn't really get that much from Achitophel, okay? Achitophel helped him a little, but nevertheless, he's so grateful and he uses such honorific terminology to refer to him. And so too we, right, should be kind of following in this example and should be treating anyone who teaches us anything as worthy of honor. Okay, and honor, here's the part that I'm excited about, means nothing but Torah. As it says, it is honor that sages inherit, kavod chachamim yinchalu, and the perfect shall inherit good, and good means the Torah. As it says, ki lekach tov natati lechem, torati al ta'azovu, I give you good instruction, do not forsake my Torah. Okay, so this is like a little bit fancy footwork. We're essentially doing a syllogism, right? That kavod equals tov, honor equals, so honor equals something that the sages have, okay? And then they are going to inherit good. So honor equals good, and good equals Torah. Ki lekach tov natati lachem, because this good instruction, right, which I hope you are recognizing from the Torah service, is good, right? That we're referring to the Torah as good. Okay, so what we've seen so far, what I hope you're getting a sense of is there's one way to read the Mishnah. There's one way to get this attitude of being great in Torah is actually the hardest thing. And because it's so hard, because it requires so many perfections in so many different ways, that's what makes it great. Okay, but now what we're seeing, right, through the speech of Moshe and through this other Mishnah in our chapter of Avot, a different perspective, right, which is first that actually learning Torah should be easy, it should be accessible, and that the smallest amount of Torah is worthy of honor and worthy of respect, right? So you don't need to see that, you know, everything is perfect. You don't need to be like a totally well and accomplished person in order to be someone who is actually really accomplished when it comes to learning Torah. Okay. We are going to, I know that I'm doing a lot of talking. I promise that there's going to be time for conversation. I want us to do one more little piece of Torah before we go back into our Mishnah, because I want to bring this into where we are now in the period of the Omer. Because the language, right, that was used for the Torah in this chapter was honor, was kavod. That there's some association with honor and the Torah, and we see that really explicitly in the conversation about Rabbi Akiva's students and what made them be vulnerable, right, to being killed in this time period. Okay, so Rabbi Akiva says, if one studied Torah in his youth, he should study more Torah in his old age. If he had students in his youth, he should have students in his old age. As it says, sow your seed in the morning. This is a verse from Ecclesiastes, from Kohelet. Sow your seed in the morning and don't hold back your hand in the evening, since you don't know which is going to succeed, this one or the other, or if both are equally good. Right, so we have this verse that says you got to keep on planting in the morning and in the evening because you don't know which one is going to be good, right? And so essentially Rabbi Akiva says, I had students in my youth, and they are equivalent to sowing your seed in the morning. And then I also had students in my old age, which is sowing the seed in the evening. And you have to keep on going because you don't know which one is going to end up being your legacy. And so here we go. They said that Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of students from Givat to Antipatris. If you don't know where that is, you're in good company because I also don't know where that is. in Judea. That doesn't help me. And they all died in one period of time because they did not treat each other with kavod, where they did not have this value of honor. And that's why they all passed away, because they don't know how to show each other this kind of kavod, this kind of honor that we were talking about in the Mishnah. And it is taught that all of them died in this period from Passover to Shavuot. Rav Chama bar Abba said, and some say it was Rabbi Chia bar Avin, they all died a bad death. And Rav Nachman said that bad death was diphtheria. And the reason why I want you to know, right, that bad death was diphtheria is that diphtheria is essentially thought of in rabbinic culture as being a fire in the throat, right? That there's something like the disease that came to them in the part of the body that they use for conversation, right? It's a disease that specifically attacked them in their throats. Okay. I'm going to pause. I'm going to pause the screen share for a second so I could see everybody, and we could have a little bit of a conversation. I want to review what we've seen so far, and then I want to take some insights from you. So essentially, we started with this Mishnah and Avot that said the reason why the Torah is so amazing and so impressive is that it's so hard to achieve. You got to get all 48 levels: listening, teaching, sensitivity to this, pure heart. I could not memorize them, let alone achieve them. Okay. And then we have this other perspective in some of the other texts that I brought of actually, maybe that's not what makes Torah valuable. Maybe Torah's value lies in its being accessible, right? And that even one letter of the Torah that somebody learns from someone else is inherently valuable and deserving of honor. And then I, wanted to make it timely, right? And say that it seems like what Rabbi Akiva's students didn't understand was exactly this, right? They were missing that element of honor when it came to their study, when it came to their learning. And that's actually what defeated them, right? And it got them right in their throats, right in the place, and especially if we're talking in an oral culture, nobody is studying Torah from a book. Everybody's studying Torah with their throats and mouths. And that got kind of attacked because of this lack of honor. And so my question for you is, what does that mean, right? What does it mean to study Torah and to treat the people that you are studying Torah from and teaching to, right, which I think is also a really important component. What does it mean to do that with this sense of kavod, with respect and with honor? So I'm not going to call on anyone right away, so I want to give people a chance to think about this question. And then I think it's probably easiest if you raise your virtual hand, because then even folks who aren't able to have their cameras on will be able to participate equally in the conversation. And I assume by now you're all veteran Zoomers and know how to raise your virtual hands. Okay. So for those of you who don't know, there's a little button that says reactions that has a smiley face and a plus. And if you hover over that, you will be able to see where it says raise hand, and that is what you will do. Okay. Let's start with Marissa.
So thank you, Rabbi. Thank you very much. I love this. Let me start out by saying I'm studying Torah with my grandson for his bar mitzvah. So the Avot, the beginning thing you gave us is what I will be teaching and learning with him this week. This is just, I think every child who is being bar mitzvah should start their bar mitzvah study with this, because I think it is so brilliant and offers a door in to the study of Torah particularly for a young 13-year-old. that is exceptional. So thank you for this. Now for my study. I'd like to go back to the sow your seed in the morning and don't hold back in the evening, since you don't know which is going to seed, one or the other, or if both are equally good morning and evening. It just immediately made me think of creation and of God's creating the light and the darkness and the day, and sitting back and saying, this is good. And that word good in this context, and in the context of what you were talking about, your question, and the Sabbath and everything that comes, the learning that comes from it, all comes to my mind here. And I'm wondering if you have any additional insight into that idea.
So it's interesting that you brought up creation and goodness in creation, because I think that there's actually the way that it's presented in the first chapter of Breshit is God created. He leaned back and he said, "This is great. Has Shabbat." End of story, right? But the way that the rabbis often talk about creation is as creating world and destroying them, And they want to have God be in a more occasionalist universe where God is actually constantly, right, engaging with the world, constantly revising, constantly tinkering. And to me, that's a more accurate manifestation of good. Right? Good is not, I finished and I put it on the shelf. Good is, and particularly if we're also thinking about this through the lens of studying Torah, good is, I enjoy, right, this thing that I have made, and I want to see it get even better. It's investment.
Yeah.
And I think that one way to think about the connection between goodness, creation, and the Torah is to see God using us in that way. Right, as instruments for improvement, and being invested in us, and having faith in us as being instruments of improvement. Okay, we're going to go now to the last hand, to Penina.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have two parts. I have an answer and I have a question.
Okay.
When you're talking about giving respect and how do we learn this, and I turn to King Solomon. And when God asked him to choose whatever he wanted and God would grant it, what did the King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, how did he answer it?
He wanted to be wise.
That we derive that wisdom, but rather what he asked for was a lev shemaya.
Mm-hmm.
Lev shemaya.
Right, like a listening heart.
A listening heart, which also is interpreted as an understanding heart and a compassionate heart. And as a king, as a judge, he would need that kind of thing. And I think each one of us need these qualities of listening, but listening with openness and with understanding and with compassion.
Great.
And
Before you go into your question, I just want to reflect on that. Because one of the ways in which I understand the block that Rabbi Akiva's students had, they weren't able to listen to each other, right? The way that they're described is as pairs, right? They're chavrutas. They're chavrutas that don't respect each other. And what is the clearest manifestation of when you don't respect someone in a learning context? You just want to hear yourself talk, and you're not really listening. And I think that you're right to bring up this element of Solomon, but it's also in the Mishnah itself, right? There's a lot in the Mishnah that is about being receptive, as well as being, a contributor and a knower. So I'm glad that you raised that. And what's your question?
What you just added. Thank you. And yes, in Hevra, this is not PC, but it's like the Chinese classroom. they used to call it a Chinese classroom where everybody's talking at the same time and you can't even hear yourself. And you're talking louder and louder, like when we go to restaurants, sometimes they're so loud with the music and the talking, and you start talking louder and louder and louder. And of course, so there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. I mean, something wrong with that, without going into small breakaway rooms where you can hear yourselves. But my question really, I really am very disturbed by all these thousands of students of Akiva had died because they didn't give respect to each other. Well, probably not even to themselves. And as a result, I felt that, did not Akiva teach this, emphasize it, practice it, see that they weren't practicing it, and certainly in a large place with so much, going on, it's hard to, there's a difference between a dispute and a debate, that kind of thing. But I'm really troubled by that. And how is it that the students didn't understand that respect for each other, for themselves, respect for God, and for Hashem, is missing in their lives, and then boom, it's mass death.
Yeah, so the element of the death is very upsetting. I think it's clearly supposed to be sending a message, and it isn't quite literal. So I can't make that less upsetting. I can only possibly make it less literal, but I'm not sure that helps that much. But in terms of the question of what is Rabbi Akiva teaching his students, right? And why are they not learning it? And I think that with Rabbi Akiva, it's sort of a particularly striking, inability, because the image that we have of him from Avot Rabbi Natan, where he wants to be shaped by Torah, right? Where he wants his heart, right, to be carved and softened. It's very jarring to see that his students don't have that quality. But I have a few thoughts. I'll try to limit myself. One is that, at least for me as an educator, I very much feel that I can put something out, but I have no control about whether or not it goes in, right? And I think that there's just some humility there, that even Rabbi Akiva, who was this great scholar and was this great teacher, and hopefully was really invested in his students, if they're not listening to each other, they're probably also not really listening to him, right? And they might be interested in the clever things that Rabbi Akiva says, but they're not really interested in learning how to be like Rabbi Akiva. And I think that goes to some of the elements of humility that were in that big list in the Mishnah, and serving the sages. Why is it important to serve the sages in order to learn Torah? Because there's both the stuff that you learn, and there's the person that you become. And the person that you become is often shaped by really wanting to emulate people. And I think that with Rabbi Akiva's students, there probably was a student culture that was the opposite of that, right? That instead of being really receptive and wanting to become like their teacher, they wanted to become great. And they didn't understand, right, the proper way to do that. Okay, we are running a little bit out of time. I feel bad about not being able to get to all of the hands. I am going to just randomly pick Sonia, and Joyce, you are first in line if you have something to say in the next round where we have conversation. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. I actually will try to be short. And I want to say first, I love this contrast that you've presented to us between is it 48 qualities, and then this honor that is that is bestowed to people for learning what they can learning what they do learn, even a letter. I can say that I myself can relate to that, and I feel that BJ as a congregation is very respectful and generous in that way. You asked us to what stood out to us among those characteristics in the Mishnah, and what stood out to me was speech. And you ended the lesson in a sense with this, I think it was diphtheria, but something that actually got to the throats of the students. I really appreciate that, that connection. I think that's basically it. There's something about the appreciation for and the honorableness of details in studying the Torah and in listening to one another and in speaking. And one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of our covenant is that I would really wish that we do pay attention to what we're about to say before we say it, that we really think about how we speak to one another and speak from ourselves with respect to how people might be receiving us. So thank you.
Great. Thank you. And I also, I like the way that your and Penina's comments sort of work together in both the speaking and the listening, right? Because if you look at that list of qualities, it's not just sit there and be quiet, right? And just absorb what everybody tells you. And that is what's going to make you great in Torah. What actually is going to make you great in Torah is, as we also said with Marissa, right? Really being involved in the process. And that is also, right, you also need to be a speaker, you need to be a participant. And of course, when you're thinking in terms of covenant, right, the covenant is about membership, right? That everybody who is participating feels that they belong. And I will just say personally, when I feel like I belong, I talk. And when I don't feel like I belong, I'm not willing to say anything. I become very self-conscious, become very silent. And so there is this way in which speaking is actually a proxy for, I'm part of this, right? My voice matters and I want to be heard. And I should be heard, right? And feeling sort of comfortable enough to assert that. Okay, I see more hands. I'm excited to hopefully get to you in the next round of conversation. I want to go back into the source sheet for a bit. So I'm sharing my screen. It's the same link that you got before from Rabbi Mintz in your own computers. Okay. We're in now the Midrash Tanhuma, where the Midrash is going to be talking about this verb to take. V'yekhu li truma, you should take a contribution for me. And it's a kind of interesting contrast that the Midrash is noticing, right? That we think of a contribution as something you give. Okay, so why is this contribution using the language of take? It's almost the wrong vector, right? I should be pushing out, and instead the image is pulling in. And so we're going to connect it to the Torah, surprise, surprise. And this is the same verse that we had in the previous text. Ki lekach tov natati lachem. I have given you a good taking. And there's also going to be a little pun here. For those of you who love puns, great. For those of you who don't love puns, you could ignore it. Business, right, is called in rabbinic parlance, giving and taking. And when you purchase something, that's called a mekach. It's called a taking. Okay, so there's going to be this really cute comparison between the taking that is the Torah and general commercial taking. Okay, so Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, you have two merchants who stand with one another. One has silk and one has spices. When they say to one another, let's make an exchange between us, right? Let's have a trade. How does it work? This one takes the spices and that one takes the silk, right? In order for the trade to work, I need to give up the thing that I'm holding. What this one has, the other does not have, and vice versa. That's commerce. I give you the money, you give me the thing. Now I no longer have the money and you no longer have the thing. Okay, I hope this is not news to anybody. But the Torah is not like this. Okay, the Torah has this special quality of, it's not like other merchandise. Because this one learns the order of seeds, Seder Zra'im, right? One of the orders of the Mishnah. And this one learns the order of times. Someone else is learning a different order of the Mishnah. So, right, in this case, right, the spices are, say, Seder Zra'im, and the silk is Seder Moed. And when they teach one another, when they say, let's have an exchange, I'll trade you all of the agricultural laws for all of the laws about the holidays, what happens? I don't lose my knowledge of the agricultural laws, and you don't lose your knowledge about the holidays. When they teach one another, this one has two, and this one has two. Is there any merchandise better than this? I just find this image to be so beautiful, right? So touching, that the regular way of the world is that when you give something away, you lose it, right? But the way that it works with Torah is when you give something away, you gain it, right? The Midrash itself doesn't quite say this, but I think it's true. It's certainly true from my own experience. When I teach something to someone else, not only do I not lose it, right? But I have reviewed the material a couple of more times, and my grasp of the material is stronger. When somebody asks me a good question and I have to respond, right, I'm deepening my understanding. And so I think actually the Midrash is underselling how amazing Torah is as merchandise, because not only does teaching it not make me lose it, teaching it actually strengthens my hold on it. It actually deepens my hold on it. Okay. And the last text that I want us to look at before we go back into the Mishnah is this is another Midrash that is trying to resolve between two verses in Mishlei that talk about a poor person and a rich person, or a person of means, meeting, and there being a different conclusion to the verse. So in the first verse, we're going to look at Mishlei 29:13. The result of the poor person and the wealthy person being in contact is that God is illuminating their eyes. And in the other verse, in Mishlei chapter 22, verse 2, when the rich person and the poor person meet, then there's no result of they both get illuminated, but there's this kind of cryptic description that God has made all of them. Okay. I promise this is all going to be relevant. Okay, so we're in the last source. We're in the sort of sixth box in this table, in Vayikra Rabbah 34. When your brother becomes impoverished, this is as it is written, a poor person and a man of means meet, and rich and poor meet, and God made all of that, right? So the Midrash is saying the way to understand these two verses and the way in which they're similar but not quite saying the same is through this metaphor, this image. A poor person, that is someone who is poor in Torah. And a man of means, that is someone who knows one or two orders of the Mishnah by heart. Okay, so now we're not talking about people who are in a different socioeconomic status. We're talking about people that are in a different learning caste, right? One person just doesn't have any access to the Torah, and the other person is in possession, right, of two orders of Mishnah that they know by heart. The poor person stands with the rich person and says, teach me, right? Teach me one chapter. I don't need to know the whole thing. Just teach me a little bit. And then he teaches him. Then God illuminates the eyes of both of them. They acquired this world and the world to come. Okay, so the verse that describes this, this confrontation as being productive of ma'or einayim, of illuminated eyes, that is when the rich person says, sure, I'll teach you. I'll take time out of my busy schedule to tell you something that I already know. Right? They're both benefiting from this. God illuminates the eyes of Shneihem, both of them. And they acquire this world and the world to come. Now, what's the other scenario? Rich and poor meet. Again, somebody who's rich in Torah and someone who is poor in Torah. There, the poor person says to that rich person, teach me one chapter. And he didn't teach him. Right? You're not really worth my time. He said to him, why do I need to sit and teach you about liquids? Okay, which is this conversation about if something becomes wet, it can then contract impurity, and what kind of liquids count for making something wet. Okay, I've already taught you a little bit about liquids. Okay, or Mima'amakim, right? The first chapter of Brachot about when a person can recite the Shema. So he says, why would I bother to teach you? I know all of this information. I am a rich person. It's not going to enrich me further to study with you because you don't have anything to give, right? And so here you can sort of see the underside of the previous text that we saw in the comparison of the Torah to merchandise, where in that chapter, so in that Midrash, it was an equal exchange. I know this order and you know that order, and we're going to do a little swap, and now we're both going to know both. But what about the situation where I'm the one who knows both orders and you know nothing and you have nothing to teach me? Then what? Okay. And so the Midrash says, well, if he's still willing to teach them, that's great. But he could easily have another attitude, which is, this is a waste of my time. Why would I learn with someone who's ignorant? That doesn't help me. Why don't you study and learn with someone who is like you? Therefore, the verse has to end by saying, God made all of them, right? And now we see that this phrase, Osei Kulam Hashem, is a little bit a threat, right? The one who made this one smart, right? The one who educated this one could make that one stupid. And the one who made that one stupid could make that one smart. Meaning, the fact that you know this Torah is actually accidental, incidental, right? It doesn't actually make you into a different class of person. And you could easily lose the Torah that you learned, and that other person who you mocked and said wasn't worth your time, right? That person could end up becoming way more educated and way more learned than you. And so I think another way to understand, right, the problem with Rabbi Akiva's students, right, their inability to show kavod might have been, well, when you're learning in chavruta, you can only go as fast as your chavruta, right? If your chavruta doesn't understand and you already understand, you have to slow down and you have to repeat yourself. And there can often be this feeling of, well, I would be making so much more progress. I would be learning so much more if I was just learning by myself. Why am I schlepping along, right, this dead weight who I'm teaching? It's not fair, it doesn't work. I'm losing time, I'm losing valuable time in learning. And what this Midrash is trying to correct is exactly that attitude, right? That if you're willing to be a teacher, even when you don't really have to be, but just because someone asks you, you're going to end up benefiting yourself and you're going to end up benefiting that other person. But if you try to hoard your Torah knowledge and you're constantly looking for opportunities to gain and you're never looking for opportunities to give, you're going to lose the little Torah that you have, right? Your attitude of trying to keep everything to yourself is going to backfire, and you're actually not going to be able to even retain the Torah that you once had. The Midrash continues to make this about literal poor people and rich people. I don't feel like we need to go into it, but I did want to put it on the sheet for those of you who did want to see the end of the Midrash. Okay, now I want to scroll back up to our Mishnah and just see how much in this Mishnah is a reflection of actually this notion of needing to listen and needing to contribute, right? And wanting to do that with this sense of honoring and with this sense of actually this is going to be mutually beneficial for all of us. Okay, so if we just go back and we look at this list, okay, we have studying, listening, and then speaking, right? Understanding heart and intelligent heart. So that's all, receptive, awe, fear, humility, joy, and purity. Okay, this is such an interesting list. And I want to just notice, right, the juxtaposition of humility and joy, right? That when we're talking about humility, we're not talking about the kind of humility where you feel bad about yourself. We're talking about the kind of humility where you take pleasure in knowing that there is somewhere for you to join, right? There's somewhere for you to grow, and that is something that brings you happiness. That's something that brings you satisfaction. Okay, we're continuing on the list. Attending to the sages, right? This gets back to wanting to not only learn from Rabbi Akiva, but to learn how to be like Rabbi Akiva, and critical give and take with friends, fine argumentation with disciples. Okay, clear thinking, study of scripture, study of Mishnah, and then there's this list of, not trying to do a bunch of other things, right? Don't be preoccupied with worldly matters. And then again, long suffering, right? I think we're basically mean patience. And I think patience is a huge component, right, of what it means to study with someone else, what it means to both listen and to teach. Both of those require a lot of patience, right? And this generosity, leiv tov, so hard for me to see this phrase, leiv tov, a good heart, and not think about our conversation earlier about what tov is, right? That there's this goodness in this exchange. Faith in the sages and acceptance of suffering. Acceptance of suffering maybe doesn't fit so perfectly unless you're talking about the suffering of having to be patient with someone who's moving a little bit more slowly than you. Recognizing your place, recognizing your portion, being happy with it, making offense about their words, not taking credit for themselves, right? Not making it about you. You love God, you are loved by other people. You love righteous ways, you love uprightness, you love reproof, right? So much of this is about love, right? It's about caring, it's about giving, who distances themselves from honor, who doesn't let their heart become swelled on account of learning, don't like to give legal decisions, right? You don't like to be in charge, and you share in the bearing of a burden with your colleague, and you're always trying to judge favorably, and establishing the law in truth and in peace. Composing oneself in study, asking and answering, listening to others, and adding, right? To me, this is almost like the distillation of everything. You're both listening and you're contributing. Shomea umosiv. You're both asking and you're answering, right? You're not in a position of feeling like, what do I have to contribute? But you're also not in a place where you're thinking, I'm the only one whose voice matters and I'm the only one who has something to contribute. Learning in order to teach and learning in order to practice, right? For me, this image of learning in order to teach is someone who understands that hoarding their knowledge is counterproductive, right? You actually want to be someone who is acquiring in order to be able to give away and understands the way in which teaching is mutually enriching. And therefore you're able to make your teacher wiser, to be exact in what you learned, and to say a thing in the name of the one who said it. Okay, now here is where I want to end with the conclusion of this Mishnah, and then we'll have a little bit more time for conversation. The crowning quality of this list is saying something in the name of the person who said it. That is what is going to bring a deliverance to the world. And this is a principle that is really spread throughout rabbinic literature, that there's this real value of hearing something in the name of someone who said it. I have this idea. It's not my own idea. It's part of a web of Torah learning in which I'm embedded. And I'm particularly feeling this now because I recently was in a shul where I listened to the Drisha, and I was very moved by the Drisha. I thought it was really beautiful. And, you know, it happens, and it was a nice experience. And then I found out that Drisha was plagiarized. And I was able to confirm with the author, the original author of those words, that like, indeed, you know, they were his, and the person who had given the Drisha that I had heard had just almost verbatim quoted this guy and had not attributed that learning. And I really felt robbed, right? I felt like, what an opportunity, right? To not only teach me this piece of Torah and give me this perspective, but also would have been an opportunity for me to like respect you more as a person and know where this Torah came from. And then when I find out, you know, that it's not stolen, you can't steal Torah, but that it was plagiarized, I was hurt. I was really hurt. I felt like I was robbed of knowing where this came from. And so my last, you know, question that I want us to talk about is like, why, right? Why is it so important for us to be quoting and attributing the Torah of someone else, right? Because there's another argument, which I assume is what, you know, the rabbi who gave this borrowed Drisha was thinking, that like, this is beautiful Torah and I'm going to share it, right? What's wrong with that? The more Torah that's out there, it's, you know, a Torah with a capital T. Why do I have to attach another person's name to it? So I just wanted to reflect on this last piece with you for the last 5 minutes that we have together, because it seems like the Mishnah is building up to this, and I want to hear from you why. Right? Why is this the pinnacle? Why is this the redemption bringing element of what it means to be a studier of Torah, you know, particularly in a community with a chavruta where there's this productive give and take? So that's my question. I'm going to give folks a moment to think, and then we'll take some ideas. Joyce, is your hand still relevant? Okay, you're first.
Okay, thanks. So I think just on this last piece, the issue of plagiarism, it's not just a Jewish issue, it's actually a secular issue. I worked on a dissertation, and you have to quote where your sources are from. You cannot take, that is like theft of ideas, actually. If you actually don't attribute properly in terms of the person who actually said it. And I think that's really paramount in the Torah. I think it's a part of, even though we think of, you know, like the Torah is the 10 Commandments, but the piece about, and I don't remember who said it, but v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha as being the piece about like all that's in the Torah. I don't know if that's Rabbi Akiva or who is Rabbi Akiva.
Rabbi Akiva who says that
I wasn't sure.
The most important principle in the Torah. Yeah.
Right. So I think that's like a big part of it. So that's what struck out for me, anyways, in terms of that piece. The other piece I wanted to reflect on was really from earlier, but I think it's tied in because I think, we're working on this covenant as a community, and we're all flawless people, we all have flaws, and none of us can do everything. So some of us might be better at, listening. Some of us might be better at, let's say, laning. Let's say, I'm just thinking about like different things that we do in services or at BJ. And we can all complement each other in terms of what our skill set is to actually then share it as a community, so that we're not, hogging the, this particular task or whatever the issue is,
Right.
So
And I think in terms of your second comment, there's something there about recognizing individuality, right? That lends strength to a community. And I think that might be what's trying to be articulated at the end of the Mishnah is we don't actually want an undifferentiated mass, an anonymous mass of information. We want information and we want Torah that is actually tied to people, right? Because a community is not an undifferentiated mass of folks. It's a number of individuals, and the strongest communities are communities where people know each other well, right? And are able to, recognize and invite people to contribute their talents. So I'm really glad that you raised that.
And I just want to say this other piece about it is that, like when each time we have a bar or bat mitzvah and they're giving their Dvar Torah, they're sharing their Torah with us as a community. And we're learning from them, from a younger person's perspective.
Yeah, great. And I
find that wonderful.
Yeah, I used to be one of these people that groaned whenever there was a bar bat mitzvah in shul. And then as I got older, I became one of these people that's like sunrise, sunset, and anytime anybody's a bar mitzvah, I can't wait to listen to the speech. So I very much understand that. The Dickers, I don't know who is actually raising their hand.
It's Stephen.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
There are
Whatever.
regarding presenting a passage of Torah or learning without attributing it to proper source. In terms of books or academia, it's obviously critical that the people who've initially proposed an idea, have expounded something, get credit. With Torah, the difference that I see, and it's also important to give credit where credit is due, but that's also so that the person presenting, like the rabbi who you saw who didn't give proper credit, doesn't present him or herself in a false light. And that's just a little difference than with the academic anti-plagiarism rules. They're similar, but when you see someone, a rabbi, speaking, you don't want to elevate them or give them a place on a pedestal that they really haven't earned.
Okay, good. And I'm actually glad that you brought up this element of elevating people and sort of putting them on a pedestal that they don't deserve, because I think, right, that what motivates someone to plagiarize, right? It's an insecurity. It's a feeling like they themselves don't have that much to contribute. Nobody wants to hear what they have to say. They hear something else interesting, and they think that if they put their name on it, then they will appear interesting and they will appear stronger. And what they're actually doing is they're just being inauthentic. And usually somebody will find that out, right? And they will be discovered, and they will be worse, right? And I think that there's that the way in which insecurity, right, ends up maybe momentarily, right, enabling this person to get some sort of, stolen valor or whatever, by representing themselves in a false light, but in a real learning environment, right, and in a real community where people are trying to get to know each other, right, that is just so counterproductive, right? Because what you want to be is your most authentic self, not necessarily your most polished or your most, sophisticated ideas, right? You actually want to have this element of being real, right? And being real entails not only just not stealing somebody else's stuff, but being able to say, well, I actually don't have anything, really interesting or the most interesting thing to say on this topic. I'm going to be honest about that. And I'm going to just bring you Torah from somewhere else and hope that, you recognize the value of what I'm bringing. So speaking of Torah from someone else, I know that there are other hands, and I'm sorry that we didn't have time to get to everyone, but I do want to make sure that we end on time. So I am going to hand the mic back over to Rabbi Mintz.
Thank you so much, Dena, and thank you to everyone for being here. And just to say, I see that just confirming there are lots of hands up. For those of you who still if you still have ideas percolating in your mind and in your heart, I want to invite you to visit our virtual community journal, which I posted the link in the chat, so you can go there. Each week we've been inviting people to share their thoughts and their experience based on the themes that we're exploring. So you can go there, share text, share a video, share audio, however you want to share it. We want to hear from you, and we want your lived experience and your Torah to help shape the vision for this community. And particularly now, as we're looking back on this whole series, there's an opportunity to go back and look at some of the videos from this series. You can listen to some of the podcasts the playlists for these last few weeks, which were especially curated for this project by Hadar's Rising Song Institute. You can go through our written journal that was shared at the beginning of the project, and all of these different ways to explore some of these themes more deeply. And then on the virtual community journal, you can actually go back and share thoughts for each of those prompts, for each of those weeks, in each of these teachings. So I do want to encourage everyone to do that. You'll get these links in an email later this week. And once again, Dena Weiss, thank you so much for leading us in this rich learning tonight. I can see from the hands in the chat that it was very, very well received. And then, but before we close, because it is late enough to be able. Hi, Daddy. It's very late for some of us. Give me one more minute, please.
Hi, Daddy.
Hello. One more minute, please.
When is it bedtime?
Very soon.
I'm not going to do bedtime with you.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm going to bedtime with
my because it is late enough for us to say the Omer, it's late enough for some folks to go to bed. I do want to invite everyone, if you were joining us for Minyan right before this, and you still have your Siddur handy, to join us in Siddur Sim Shalom. This is on beginning on page 237, and we're counting the 46th day of the Omer. We are getting close. And again, this is page 237 in Siddur Sim Shalom. הנני מוכן ומזומן לקיים מצוות עשה של ספירת העומר, כמו שכתוב בתורה, וספרתם לכם ממחרת השבת, מיום הביאכם את עומר התנופה 7 שבתות תמימות תהיינה, עד ממחרת השבת השביעית תספרו 50 יום, ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו על ספירת העומר. היום 6 ו40 יום, שהם 6 שבועות ו4 ימים לעומר. Erev Tov, everyone. Chodesh Tov. Have a good evening, and hope to see you all very soon.